The winter dawn was still half-formed when the boy appeared at the edge of the ruined orchard, a slim silhouette wrapped in a coat too large for his narrow shoulders, clutching the small tin whistle that had once belonged to his father before the war scattered their world like ash on wind. At 13, he moved with the quiet tension of someone who had learned far too early that sound could mean death and silence could be a warning. Yet on that morning, the frost beneath his boots cracked in tiny protests as he slid between the skeletal branches and gazed toward the distant farmstead where the Allied unit had set camp for the night. The sky smelled of coal smoke and frozen earth, and the breath of the fields rose like pale ghosts drifting across the trenches carved hastily into the soil. He lifted the whistle to his lips, not to play but to test its chill, remembering how his father had taught him that metal could betray desperation with the wrong vibration, that a whistle should only be used when the world was listening. The boy blinked into the horizon, where the German convoy was still no more than a smudge of movement, a threat slowly coagulating on the snow-white canvas of the valley, and he felt his stomach tighten with the instinctive certainty that he did not have long before their engines grew loud enough to swallow the morning. He trembled once, refused to tremble again, and stepped forward as though driven by the echo of every night he had seen people make the mistake of waiting too long to warn someone they loved. The Allied soldiers had trusted him in the strange, cautious way grown men sometimes trust a child in wartime, not fully believing his instincts, yet not daring to ignore them either. They had given him a crust of bread, a threadbare scarf, a place near their fire the previous night where he had watched them polish their rifle and count their ammunition with the exhaustion of men who knew dawn could bring salvation or ending. One of the soldiers, a young lieutenant with grey-blue eyes that made him look like he had aged 20 years in two, had knelt beside him and asked about the whistle. The boy had simply said, "It's how I speak when speaking is dangerous," and the lieutenant had nodded as though the answer carried the weight of an entire philosophy. Now the boy replayed that moment as he crept closer to the ridge. He heard the distant rumble, barely a vibration at first, but unmistakable to someone who had learned to feel danger in the soles of his feet. He knew the Germans would strike without pause, that the farm with its crumbling barn and narrow stone wall offered little defense, and that the unit still asleep inside would not have time to evacuate unless someone warned them. He stopped at the top of the ridge as the first thin beam of light spilled over the valley. Below him, the Allied camp was barely stirring, a handful of shadows packing equipment, unaware that the thunder approaching from the north was not the weather turning, but the mechanical snarl of engines preparing to unleash fire. His pulse hammered against his ribs with the same frantic rhythm that had saved him once before when his village burned behind him and the world collapsed in a single roar of flame. He swallowed hard, lifted the whistle again, and hesitated long enough to feel fear twist into a sharper, colder version of courage. Then he exhaled with all the strength he possessed, releasing a high, piercing sequence of notes that shattered the fragile dawn. The sound ricocheted off the frozen trees, slicing through the valley like a blade of silver. Soldiers jerked upright, rifles half raised, scanning wildly until they saw him standing alone against the pale sky. The lieutenant recognized the urgency immediately and shouted orders that spread like a spark through dry grass. Men scrambled for their packs, overturned ammunition crates snapped shut, and boots pounded the ground as the camp transitioned from sleep to survival in seconds. The boy blew the whistle again, this time longer, sharper, signaling not just danger, but immediacy. As the first artillery shell exploded far too close to where he had been standing, showering the ridge with a violent plume of dirt and smoke, he stumbled back, his ears ringing yet still gripping the whistle like a lifeline. The Allies surged toward cover in a frantic wave, their movements quick and chaotic, but they were moving, alive, because he had acted before the world could erase them. And as another explosion ripped through the orchard below, the boy felt something fierce and fragile inside him ignite, a realization that in a war shaped by armies and commanders, a single sound from a child's trembling breath could still bend fate long enough to save lives. Smoke swallowed the valley in waves that rolled like a wounded sea, each gust of wind dragging the scent of burning straw and oil across the frost-bitten field. The boy crawled down from the ridge, heart still galloping in the cage of his ribs, his knees cutting open on sharp stones as he moved through the black dust. The air trembled with explosions farther east, the kind that made the earth shudder, as though it wanted to sink into itself to escape the violence of men. Through the grey mist, he saw the remnants of the Allied camp scattering toward the woods, silhouettes that looked both victorious and lost. The lieutenant was among them, shouting hoarse orders, his voice cracking as if every syllable cost him something he didn't have left to give. When he caught sight of the boy, his eyes widened with disbelief, not at the fact that the child had warned them, but that he had survived the inferno that followed. They met in the middle of the chaos, amid the echoing thunder of retreat and survival. The lieutenant grabbed the boy's shoulders, shook him lightly, and said something drowned by the surrounding noise, though the gratitude was clear even without words. The boy's face was streaked with soot, his hair clinging to his forehead, his hands trembling around the small whistle that now felt heavier than. Behind them, the barn that had served as their shelter groaned as flames devoured its roof. Horses screamed somewhere in the distance. The boy turned his head, eyes reflecting the infernal light, and wondered how many times the earth could burn before there was nothing left worth saving. When the Germans realized their initial bombardment had failed to crush the Allied outpost, they advanced with methodical precision. Their boots sank into the mud, their rifles gleamed faintly beneath the smoke. The lieutenant ordered a fallback to the river line, his men spreading out in thin formation, firing short, desperate bursts to cover one another. The boy followed them instinctively, crouching low, clutching the whistle close to his chest as if it were a relic. The ground beneath him quaked as shells exploded in rhythmic fury, and once, when he stumbled, a soldier caught his arm and dragged him behind a fallen tree. The man muttered something about luck and madness, that the whistle was ridiculous, that no one should have listened, and yet without it, they would all have been vapor and silence. They reached the river just as the smoke turned crimson with sunrise. Frost floated on the water's surface like shattered glass. The lieutenant pointed toward the opposite bank, ordering his men to cross in pairs, and as they moved, the boy realized he was the last one still on the near side. He could hear the Germans shouting somewhere behind him, boots crushing debris, the metallic breath of their advance coming closer. He raised the whistle again, not to warn, but to signal direction. 2 short notes, one long, a pattern improvised, but somehow understood. The men turned, gesturing for him to hurry. He ran then, his legs stiff, lungs clawing for air, the whistle bouncing against his chest with every step. Bullets tore the ground near his feet, splashing mud and sparks. But the world had already narrowed to one simple truth. He had to keep running, because life demanded motion, even when everything else was crumbling. When he reached the opposite shore, the lieutenant was waiting. He pulled the boy to his feet, wrapped him in a rough blanket, and said in a low, breathless voice that he had done more than anyone could ask. The boy didn't answer. He only stared at the river, at the bridge of fog stretching over the dark water, and wondered how many others had been lost in that smoke. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the exhaustion and fear, he felt the faint stir of pride, not the loud kind that men carried into war, but a quiet, flickering warmth that came from knowing he had mattered. Night fell again before the echoes of bombardment faded. The soldiers huddled near the embers of a dying fire, whispering about the boy's ridiculous whistle a strange miracle that had bought them just enough time to live. Some laughed softly, as soldiers do when they need to keep their hearts from breaking. Others prayed. The boy listened to them without moving, the whistle resting in his palm, cold and mute now, like a secret he wasn't sure he wanted any. The lieutenant watched him in silence, recognizing in that frail frame the shape of courage, not the kind written into medals, but the kind that existed only in the brief space between fear and action. If you felt the tension and courage of this part, take a moment to subscribe. More stories like this one are coming. The river ran slow and bitter beneath the wan light of dawn, carrying with it the ashes of the night before. Charred wood, shreds of uniforms, the occasional shimmer of something metallic vanishing beneath the current like memory itself. The boy sat near its edge, wrapped in a coat that smelled of smoke and oil, his bare toes digging into the frozen soil as he watched the water twist and swirl with the weight of the dead. Around him, the soldiers had begun to rebuild the remnants of their camp, though the word camp now meant little more than a patch of mud and trembling exhaustion. They had survived the bombing, escaped the fire, but survival was a thin victory in a place where every sunrise felt like a reprieve rather than a promise. The lieutenant moved between them, giving orders quietly, as if the sound of authority could break the fragile stillness that followed destruction. And yet his gaze often drifted to the boy, that small, watchful presence who had turned a piece of tin and breath into salvation. For hours, no one spoke much. The boy's whistle lay beside him on a rock, its surface blackened, its mouthpiece bent slightly where shrapnel had grazed it. He picked it up, turned it over in his fingers, and wondered if it would ever sing again. He didn't feel like a hero. Heroes, in his imagination, didn't tremble when the wind carried the smell of burning. Heroes didn't sit awake at night listening for the low hum of enemy engines. He felt instead like a fragment of something too large to comprehend, a whisper inside a storm, small but undeniable. The lieutenant approached at last, his boots crunching softly in the frost. He sat beside the boy without a word, removed his gloves, and held his hands out toward the faint warmth of a nearby fire. After a moment, he spoke. "You saved us," he said, his voice cracked and weary. "You know that, don't you?" The boy didn't look at him. "They'll come again," he murmured. "They always come again." The lieutenant nodded slowly. He didn't try to argue. They both knew the truth of it. War was patient, and men were tireless in their cruelty. Yet something in the boy's tone made him turn, searching the young face for a spark of hope. What he found instead was resolve, the strange, stoic acceptance of someone who had already seen too much to believe in miracles, but too stubborn to give up on them entirely. As the day bled into afternoon, scouts returned from the western ridge. The enemy had fallen back to regroup, perhaps shaken by the unexpected resistance, perhaps preparing for another strike. The Allies had a brief window to retreat further south. Orders came from the radio operator, his voice trembling with static. Move at dusk, abandon the valley, and make for the rail line that would take them towards safer ground. The lieutenant relayed the message, and the men began packing what little they still owned. The boy watched, the whistle dangling loosely between his fingers. He didn't know where they were going, only that wherever they went, the war would follow like a shadow. When night came, they moved in silence, following the narrow trail that wound through skeletal trees. The moon hung low and pale, casting long, broken reflections across the water. The boy walked at the rear of the line, his small figure swallowed by the rhythm of soldiers' boots and laboured breath. Each crunch of snow seemed to echo too loudly. Each gust of wind sounded like the hum of approaching engine. His mind played tricks on him, stitching fear into every sound. But then, out of the dark, he heard something different. Not the roar of trucks, or the click of rifles, but a faint, steady beat. He froze, holding his breath. It wasn't a trick. The sound came from behind them, faint at first, then clearer, the rumble of distant engines crossing the far ridge. The lieutenant sensed it too. He lifted his hand, motioning for silence. The column stopped, hearts pounded in unison. They were being followed. The Germans had found their trail quicker than expected. The lieutenant turned to the boy, whose eyes shone wide in the dark. "Can you still use it?" he whispered. The boy looked down at the whistle. The bent mouthpiece glinted in the moonlight, a relic of near death. He hesitated only a moment, then nodded. The lieutenant gave him a faint smile, part trust, part despair, and gestured for the men to move quickly toward the ravine ahead. If the boy could distract the pursuers, even for minutes, it might save them again. He climbed a small rise overlooking the trail, the cold biting into his fingers as he lifted the whistle to his lips. His breath trembled once, then steadied. The first note came sharp and haunting, echoing through the trees like a cry from another world. It was followed by two shorter blasts, the same signal that had once meant danger, urgency, life. Down below, the Allies accelerated into the dark, their silhouettes swallowed by shadow. Behind him, voices shouted, German this time, harsh and confused. The boy smiled faintly despite the fear. The ridiculous whistle had fooled them once, perhaps it would again. When the soldiers vanished beyond the ravine and the enemy veered toward his echoing signal, the boy ran, not away from danger, but alongside it, threading himself through the narrow veins of the forest, a ghost between fire and frost. His heart hammered, his breath tore at his throat, but he ran until the sound of engines faded into nothing. Only then did he stop, collapsing to his knees beneath a tree, clutching the whistle to his chest as though it were the heartbeat of something greater than himself. The river murmured somewhere below, as if remembering him, as if promising it would carry his sound forever. Dawn rose like a wounded animal over the forest, dragging its pale light through the mist. The boy's breath hung in the air, slow and uneven, while frost settled in a delicate crust on his eyelashes. He had spent the night hidden in the hollow of an uprooted tree, the whistle still pressed against his chest, its metal warmth fading into the cold of his skin. His legs ached, his fingers were numb, but his heart still beat, steady and stubborn, a fragile proof that he had survived once more. Around him, the forest whispered with the ghosts of war. Distant artillery, the crack of branches under cautious boots, the low hum of fear. Every sound carried meaning now. Every silence carried threat. Somewhere beyond the trees, the lieutenant's unit had made it to the rail line. The boy hoped so. though hope in wartime was a currency too fragile to trade often. He rose slowly, scanning the grey woods, his body a map of exhaustion and instinct. Then he heard it. Voices close this time, speaking in the clipped, hard rhythm of German. They were searching. He could hear the shuffle of boots on frost, the muttered orders, the rattle of rifle. They were close enough that he could smell the smoke on their coats. His hand moved to the whistle again, the one absurd, impossible tool that had kept him alive. And he thought of the lieutenant's words, "You saved us." The words had sounded heavy then. Now they felt like a burden. He slipped deeper into the forest, careful where he placed each step. The ground was a patchwork of snow and dead leaves, and every crunch could be the one that betrayed him. He moved until he found the frozen remains of a stream, its surface glistening like glass beneath the morning sun. There, he knelt and dipped his fingers into the icy water, washing away the grime and blood from his hands. The cold stung him awake. He studied his reflection, thin, sharp, older somehow than the boy who had once played harmless tunes for village festivals. The whistle gleamed faintly against his chest, and for a moment he wondered if his father would have recognized him now. When the voices drew closer again, he ducked behind a fallen log. 3 German soldiers emerged through the fog, rifles slung, moving in cautious formation. Their faces were tired, their breath steaming in short bursts. The boy could hear them talking about the Allied retreat, about a British officer and a child who had vanished into the trees. The lieutenant, him, he held his breath, his fingers tightening on the whistle. He knew he couldn't outrun them if they found him, but he also knew the forest better than they did. He waited until they passed, then slipped away in the opposite direction, every nerve alive with terror and purpose. Hours passed before he found the tracks. Parallel lines of iron cutting through the frost. The rail line. He followed them south, eyes scanning for movement. At last, he spotted the remnants of the Allied camp near an abandoned signal tower. Smoke rose weakly from a fire. He stumbled toward it, calling softly, afraid to shout. A shadow moved, then another, and soon the lieutenant appeared, his face pale with disbelief. He ran forward, catching the boy by the shoulders, pulling him close in a rough embrace. "You made it," he said, voice breaking. "Good God, you made it." The soldiers gathered around, their expressions a mixture of awe and relief. The boy managed a faint smile, though his body was trembling from cold and hunger. Someone handed him a mug of weak coffee. Someone else draped a coat over his shoulders. The world felt softer, briefly, a fragile pocket of warmth carved out of the cruelty that surrounded them. The lieutenant sat beside him, silent for a long time, before finally speaking. "They'll regroup soon," he said. "We need to move before they cut us off again." The boy nodded. He understood. There was no end to this chase, only small victories stitched together by survival. Later that night, as the men prepared their equipment, the lieutenant unfolded a worn map beneath the faint light of a lantern. "We'll head for the village of Tournai," he said. "If we can cross the ridge before dawn, we might find transport there." He looked at the boy. "You're staying with me. No arguments." The boy didn't argue. He simply placed the whistle on the map, a tiny gleam against the ink lines, and said quietly, "It'll be ready." The lieutenant stared at the whistle for a moment, that ridiculous little thing that had somehow rewritten their fate twice. He nodded slowly, almost reverently. "Then so will we." When the time came to move, the sky had turned the color of bruised steel. Snow began to fall, soft at first, then heavier, muting the world in a hush so deep it felt sacred. The boy walked beside the lieutenant, their footsteps leaving twin paths in the white. Ahead, the forest opened into a frozen plain. Behind them, the echoes of war lingered, distant but relentless. At one point, the lieutenant stopped and looked back. In the far distance, faint flashes pulsed along the horizon, artillery fire blooming like dying stars. "You know," he said softly, not quite to the boy, "they'll write songs about this war, about the soldiers, the generals, maybe even the battle, but not about the boy who saved them with a whistle." The boy's voice was barely more than a whisper. "Then I'll remember for them." The lieutenant smiled, a small, tired smile, and they walked on through the snow, 2 figures swallowed slowly by the storm. The snow fell heavier as they approached Tournai, turning the ruined fields into a blinding, shifting sea of white. The boy's legs ached with every step, but he kept walking beside the lieutenant, following the faint outline of the village in the distance, a scatter of rooftops half buried under snow and silence. The war had passed through here weeks ago, leaving only what war always leaves, the echo of lives interrupted. Doors hung open like mouths mid-scream, windows shattered by shells now filled with icicles that glittered in the pale morning light. A church steeple leaned at an impossible angle, Its bell twisted into a shape that no longer rang for anyone. The boy stopped at the edge of the square. A single cart lay overturned beside the fountain, its wooden wheels frozen in place. He could see bullet holes punch through the walls, see a child's toy, a small wooden horse, half sunk in snow near the steps of what had once been a bakery. He picked it up, brushed off the frost, and stared at it for a long time. The lieutenant watched him quietly, his face drawn, eyes hollow from too many nights without sleep. "Come," he said at last. "We'll shelter in the church. If there's anyone left, they'll find us." Inside, the church smelled of smoke and stone. The stained glass windows had been shattered long ago, leaving shards that caught the weak sunlight and threw fractured colours across the pews. A crucifix still hung above the altar, though half of Christ's face had been burned away. The lieutenant motioned for the boy to sit. He and the few remaining soldiers began to set up a perimeter, whispering in low tones, scanning the street for signs of movement. The boy removed the whistle from around his neck and placed it on the stone beside him, listening to the faint ticking of his own heartbeat. Hours passed. The snow muffled everything, the creak of boots, the murmurs of men, even the distant thunder of artillery. It was the kind of silence that feels like the world holding its breath. The boy drifted between wakefulness and sleep, images flickering in his mind. His father's face before the war, the orchard where he had first learned to whistle, the ridge burning under the dawn. Somewhere in that haze, he heard a sound, faint but distinct, not engine, not footstep, a human sound, crying. He rose, moving toward the side chapel. The sound grew clearer, a muffled sob, the trembling breath of someone trying not to be heard. The boy knelt beside the collapsed confessional and saw movement in the shadows. A small figure, barely older than he was, wrapped in a tattered shawl. A girl. Her face was pale and streaked with dirt, her eyes wild with fear. When she saw him, she shrank back, clutching a wooden rosary to her chest. "It's all right," he whispered. "I'm not one of them." The lieutenant appeared moments later, gun raised, then lowered it at the sight of the child. She spoke quickly in French, words tumbling out between sobs. The boy caught fragments. Parents gone. Soldiers came, hid here. She had survived alone for 3 days, stealing bits of bread from the ruins, waiting for a miracle that never came. The lieutenant's face softened. "We'll take her with us," he said quietly. "No one should die here." That night, they lit a small fire in the center of the church, careful to keep it hidden from the outside. The flames cast trembling shadows on the walls, turning the ruined saints into flickering ghosts. The girl slept beside the boy, her breathing steady now, her small hand resting near the whistle. The lieutenant sat apart, writing something in a notebook, a list of names perhaps, or a message for command he might never send. The boy watched him, sensing the heaviness that clung to him like smoke. Outside, the snow had stopped, but the silence had changed. It was heavier now, the kind of quiet that comes before thunder. The lieutenant heard it too. He stood, listening, then whispered a single word that sent the men scrambling. "Engines!" The Germans were coming again, this time from the northern road. The boy felt his chest tighten as panic rippled through the soldiers. They had nowhere left to run. The river was frozen, the bridges gone, and the forest behind them was a graveyard. The lieutenant's eyes met the boy's. No words were needed. The whistle lay between them, on the stone. He picked it up, feeling its weight, not of metal, but of fate. His lips trembled, not from cold, but from what he knew it would mean. He could lure the Germans away again, give the soldiers and the girl time to escape, but he also knew what that would cost. The lieutenant must have seen that realization in his eyes, because his expression changed, from command to sorrow. "You don't have to," he said. The boy shook his head slowly. "Yes," he whispered, "I do." He slipped out the side door, into the snow. The lieutenant called after him once, softly, but didn't follow. Some choices belong to the young because the old have already lost the strength to bear them. Outside, the boy moved through the square, his small shape vanishing in the white. He raised the whistle, took a deep breath, and let out a long, piercing note, the same sound that had once saved them. It echoed through the village, sharp and haunting, a call that carried through the ruins and into the dark woods beyond. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Then came the answering roar of engines. Inside the church, the lieutenant closed his eyes. "God help him," he murmured. And in the snow outside, the boy ran once more, not away from death, but toward the only kind of courage he understood. The snow had turned to ash again. It fell thick and grey as the German convoy entered the ruined village, its tanks grinding through what little remained of the streets, iron teeth chewing on the bones of houses and the remnants of forgotten lives. The boy moved through the labyrinth of rubble like a phantom, darting from doorway to doorway, each footstep a whisper swallowed by the storm. The whistle was still warm from his breath, pressed tightly in his palm. Behind him, through the broken windows of the church, he could see the faint flicker of firelight, the lieutenant and the others waiting, their lives balanced on the thin edge of his courage. The sound of the engines was closer now, low and guttural, the rhythm of inevitability. The boy ducked behind a wall and counted. 3 trucks, 2 half-tracks, a squad on foot. He felt the vibration under his knees as they advanced, their boots crunching over ice, their rifles raised, their voices sharp and metallic in the cold air. He knew they would search every house, every ruin, until they found the soldiers hiding inside the church. There was no time to hesitate. He took one deep breath, the kind his father had told him to take before diving underwater, when silence could be survival, and raised the whistle to his lips. The first note cut through the village like lightning. It was shrill, piercing, alive. The soldiers froze, startled, weapons swinging toward the sound. He blew again, this time in short, frantic bursts, the same pattern he had used to signal danger. To the Germans, it was chaos. To his friends, it was salvation. He darted across the street as bullets ripped through the walls behind him. Splinters flew like rain. He didn't look back. His boots slipped on the frozen stones. His lungs burned with the effort, but he ran, weaving through the ruins, drawing their fury away from the church. The Germans shouted, spreading out, convinced they were chasing a small Allied scout. One of them yelled, Da! In die Straße! And the chase turned into a hunt. The boy stumbled into the old train yard at the edge of the village. The skeletons of carriages loomed around him, their doors hanging loose, the tracks vanishing into snow. He hid behind a derailed wagon, panting, the whistle still clutched in his hand. He could hear them coming. Boots, voices, the grinding of metal. There was nowhere left to go. He looked down at the whistle, the absurd little thing that had once belonged to his father, that had somehow defied death more than once. Its mouthpiece was cracked now, the edge jagged. He smiled faintly, as if acknowledging its exhaustion. Then he lifted it one final time and blew. The sound that came out was raw and broken, half note, half scream, a cry of defiance, of grief, of a child refusing to vanish quietly. It echoed off the metal wagons, rebounding again and again, until it became impossible to tell where it began or ended. The Germans fired wildly into the mist. Sparks erupted against steel. One bullet struck close enough to tear the sleeve of his coat. Another shattered the wagon beside him, sending shards of iron into the air. He stumbled, fell, then rose again, limping toward the open tracks. Far away, in the church, the lieutenant heard the whistle's echo and understood. He turned to his men. Now! He shouted. They gathered the girl, the maps, the radio, everything they could carry, and slipped out through the southern gate while the gunfire drew north. The lieutenant looked back once, saw the flash of explosions blooming near the train yard, and clenched his jaw so hard his teeth hurt. When the Germans reached the source of the sound, there was nothing left but smoke and snow. The whistle lay half buried beside the tracks, its surface blackened, its shape still intact. One soldier picked it up, turned it over in confusion, then tossed it aside. They didn't understand what it had meant, that its final note had not been surrender, but victory. At dawn, the lieutenant and the survivors emerged from the forest. The village behind them was gone, swallowed by fire and distance. He walked in silence, the girl sleeping in his arms, his men too tired to speak. In his coat pocket, he carried something cold, the whistle, retrieved from the snow when he had dared return hours later. It no longer made a sound, but it didn't need to, because sometimes a single note is enough to carry across a war. The war ended not with triumph, but with exhaustion. It faded like a fever, breaking after too many sleepless nights, leaving behind the pale ghosts of those who had endured it and the silence of those who never could. When the lieutenant finally returned to his homeland months later, he carried with him the remnants of a life stitched together by survival, a faded map, a half-filled notebook, and a small bent whistle wrapped carefully in cloth. He seldom spoke of Tournai, not to his superiors, who saw war only in numbers and lines on paper, nor to the strangers who asked polite questions about victory. Some truths, he understood, were too sacred for the language of reports. Yet the sound of that whistle, sharp, trembling, defiant, never left him. It lingered in his sleep, in the crackle of fire at night, in the shrill cry of trains passing distant stations. It was as if the boy's breath had become part of the wind itself, forever circling back to remind him what courage truly sounded like. He visited the ruins once, in the spring of 1946. Grass had begun to reclaim the village, weaving green over the blackened stones. The church was nothing but a fractured shell, the bell long gone, the altar scorched. He found the fountain where the boy had once stood and knelt beside it, tracing his fingers across the frost-worn stone. From his coat pocket, he took the whistle and placed it gently on the edge, facing east, toward the river the boy had loved to watch. For a long while, he said nothing. Then, quietly, he whispered the only prayer that ever felt right. "Thank you." He left it there, but the sound did not fade. Children from nearby towns would later speak of hearing something strange when the wind blew from the north, a faint whistle echoing through the fields, rising and falling like a song no one remembered learning. Some said it was just the wind through broken beams. Others swore it came from the boy who had saved a battalion with nothing but breath and bravery. Either way, the legend spread quietly, passed from mouth to mouth, from campfire to classroom, until it became less a story and more a heartbeat buried inside history. Years later, when the lieutenant was an old man, he found himself on a park bench one cold afternoon, watching a group of schoolchildren play. One of them, a boy no older than 13, was running with a whistle on a string around his neck. He blew it again and again, laughing, unaware of how that sound reached into the marrow of an old man's soul. The lieutenant's eyes filled with tears he did not hide. The boy looked over, puzzled, and waved. The lieutenant smiled weakly, nodded, and for a fleeting instant he saw another face there, a face from the snow, eyes fierce and unyielding, lips trembling as they drew breath for one last call. When the old soldier died a few months later, they found the story written in his notebook, not as a military report, but as a memory, written in a hand that shook with reverence. He was 13, he had nothing, but with one whistle, he saved us all. And so the sound lived on, through the wind, through time, through every child's breath that dared to rise against fear. Because some songs are too brave to vanish, some voices, though young, never die.